I started in 2020 determining my best read. Some really great books have won along the way, and it is now time to figure out our winner for 2024. For those of you who are wondering why I haven't been making a lot of videos, sorry, sometimes life gets in the way. And when I moved, I ended up in Airplane Alley. There's just constantly background noises, airplanes flying by, children running around outside, lawn maintenance noises. I've just decided, since I need to do this end of the year book battle, the audio is just not going to be perfect. I'm sorry. Here we go. Let's look back to January. I had some good reads. I was reading about 8 books a month the first half of the year, and then 4 books a month the second half of the year. So you can see in my January book battle, there were 8 books. In the end, it came down to a finals with Arkady Martine's duology's second book, A Desolation Called Peace, up against They Called Us the Enemy by George Takei. It was a tough one because Arkady Martine's Desolation Called Peace was the follow-up after Memory Called Empire. These were really good science fiction books, which I highly recommend. But that series lost out because George Takei's graphic novel, They Called Us the Enemy, was very powerful emotionally, and I felt deserved the win there. In February, I had 8 books once again. It came down to a finals of the 1961 Hugo Award winner for Best Novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr., up against the memoir Warriors Don't Cry by Melba Pattillo Bills. And as much as I like both of these books, I once again gave it to the more real-world emotional impact story. Had me in tears as I really felt and had a better understanding for what happened with the integration of schools in American history. So the winner for February was Warriors Don't Cry. And then in March, looking at 8 books again, ended up in finals. R.E. Palmer's Song of Echo series book 4, Crown of Sorrows, up against You Are a Complete Disappointment by Mike Edison. You Are a Complete Disappointment was a memoir which was very humorous and interesting to read about a son who just could not live up to what his father wanted from him. But it lost out because my best read that month was R.E. Palmer's book. Really great fantasy being written now, but feeling like classic fun adventure fantasy. That brings us to April, another round of good reads. I had in the finals book 1 of the Fitz and the Fool series, Fool's Assassin by Robin Hobb, up against a book of poetry by Shane Koizikan, Visiting Hours. There was just something about April. I ended up giving this to the poetry book. Really powerful poetry. I guess I was feeling emotional the first half of the year, giving a lot of these wins to the more books full of trauma, books full of emotional resonance. And then May was Horror Mayhem. Interestingly, it ended up as a finals of Stephen King's story collection Night Shift, up against Stephen King writing as Richard Bachman with the book The Long Walk. King versus King, I couldn't go wrong. Night Shift getting the win there. That was followed by June on the Range with some fun cowboy stories and that sort of thing. The 2 finalists for the month were Robin Hobb's Assassin's Fate, the end of that trilogy, up against Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner, which was a memoir, again emotionally powerful, real true story, which got it the win ultimately in that month. About halfway through the year, I admitted defeat for being able to continue reading so much. Just a busy schedule, which I know is ironic for a teacher to say during the summer. But in July, I cut it down to just 4 books. I have finally managed to achieve my goal of forcing myself to read less. I had a lot of books from NetGalley going on in June and July and August. Really interesting that of the 4 books, the 2 finalists, one of them was a NetGalley finale book. It was called The Book of Elsewhere. It's by Keanu Reeves and China Miéville. This is a weird book. I say weird as a positive connotation. Mix of sci-fi, fantasy, kind of comic book, superhero, action. It was up against A Voyage of Arcturus by David Lindsay, which is a classic adventure story from Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Very happy I was able to keep reading Roger's Cheap Old Book Club selections each month, even though they don't normally get to finals. The winner for July was the Keanu Reeves book. It was weird, had a lot of jumps in time, kind of confusing, but still enjoyable. It was published in July, so you can get that book if you're interested in it. In August, my finalist came down to the book 1 of the Apprentice at Depth series, Split Infinity by Piers Anthony. This is a weird sci-fi fantasy book. A guy who does some inappropriate things with an android. It's weird whether this man is falling in love with the various different creatures. It was up against Flying Lessons and Other Stories, edited by Ellen O. This really was literary fiction. Really great stories. Flying Lessons and Other Stories got the win as my best read in August. That takes us to September, when I finally picked up The Drowned Kingdom Book 4, A Lion's Pride by P.L. Stuart. I sometimes forget that this is meant to be a 7-book series. You know, after the first few books, I was somewhat hoping for more of a conclusion, but of course it's not a conclusion. It's the middle book in the 7-book series. It was wonderful. It was joined in finals by The Hollow by Agatha Christie, a Hercule Poirot mystery novel, which was fun, but not at the level of P.L. Stewart's A Lion's Pride, which got the win. And you will see here, fantasy is getting a lot of wins in the second half of the year. In October, I was able to read, released about October 22nd, toward the end of the month, the Bloodsworn Trilogy Book 3, The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne. So happy that John Gwynne was able to finish this series. It's a lot of combat. It's a whole lot of combat. It's a lot of violence, but it's a fun read. It was joined in finals by a reread, Shane Koizikan's poetry book, Stick Boy. I'm giving the win to John Gwynne's book. And then in November, I think Nonfiction November may be dead. I went with a reread November. They were all rereads for me, and that was exciting. For finals, we've got the reread via audiobook, which I started in October, but got busy and distracted. It is The Way of Edan by Philip Chase, up against some poetry by Shane Koizikan To This Day, which you may have heard on YouTube. A lot of his poetry is online spoken word. I'm giving the win to The Way of Edan by Philip Chase, because the book is even better upon a reread. Knowing the story, knowing the characters, where they're going to go in the trilogy, it was great to go back to the roots. And then for December, I know I said I'd been reading about 4 books a month the second half of the year, but December does not get 4 books. December gets 2 books, which makes it a default finals, because Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere Stormlight Archive Book 5, Wind and Truth came out. The book is over 1,300 pages long. I wanted to finish out my commitment to Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, so I also read Type E by Herman Melville, which is weird because it's supposedly based on Herman Melville's actual travels, the Polynesian area, interacting with people, but it's an adventure, like a classic historical adventure story. Between these 2 books, the win is going to the book that is perhaps the most Sanderlanche of all the Sanderlanches, Wind and Truth. Well, those are our winners from the year, so we slot them into our book battle slots to have our ultimate book battle now. January versus February, it's the graphic novel They Called Us Enemy by George Takei, up against the memoir Warriors Don't Cry by Melba Patillo Beals. These are perhaps the 2 most realistic, powerful, U.S. history-oriented books of the year. Perhaps they should both just win by default. But that's not how the book battle works. We gotta battle it out. Between them, I'm gonna give the victory to the memoir Warriors Don't Cry. It will evoke tears from you. read the book. For March and April, we've got the fantasy book, Song of Echoes, Book 4, Crown of Sorrows by R.E. Palmer, up against the poetry, Visiting Hours by Shane Koizikan. I enjoyed both of these reads, but the April book, the poetry, is going to get the win in advance in this instance. For May and June, we've got Night Shift, those horror stories by Stephen King, up against the memoir Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. Either of these could probably win Best Read of the Year as well. A lot of good books here in the book battle. Gonna give the win to Stephen King, though. You've probably seen all kinds of movies and adaptations based off of some of these stories. We then have a wild card spot in the middle of the year, which I am going to give to the science fiction story A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine, which I feel like only lost out because it was against itself within the duology early in the year. Which brings us to the wild card spot number 2 for the second half of the year. I'm going to give this to the other half of that duology, the science fiction by Arkady Martine, A Desolation Called Peace, which only lost out up against the really serious, realistic based stories. Now let's take a look at July and August. July, we've got the weird sci-fi fantasy superhero story, The Book of Elsewhere by Keanu Reeves. Yes, that Keanu Reeves. And China Miéville. It is up against the literary Flying Lessons and Other Stories, edited by Ellen O. I'm going to give the win to the literary short story collection. For September and October, we've got fantasy. It is the Drowned Kingdom Book 4, Alliance Pride by P.L. Stuart, up against the Bloodsworn Trilogy Book 3, The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne. Recommend both series, recommend both authors. Check them out if you love fantasy. P.L. Stewart's going to get the win here. I felt like The Fury of the Gods by John Gwynne was absolutely spectacular, but way more combat than I expected. If I would criticize that book, it would be maybe tone down the combat a little bit, maybe a little less combat, for more introspection. And that is something that P.L. Stewart's book really does well in the second half of it. Lots of combat, interesting stuff, but more introspection, slowing down in the second half. We then get to November and December. Here we are, catching up with real time. My reread of The Way of Edan, the only reread to make it into the end of the year book battle, book by Philip Chase. It is up against Brando Sandoz, The Stormlight Archive Book 5, Wind and Truth. Again, if you like fantasy, I recommend both authors, both series. Brandon Sanderson's fantasy does something that makes it less of my favorite, which is I often talk about the bloat. It is too many pages. Books have gotten too big, and that is something I warn you fantasy authors of. The books do not have to keep getting bigger as you write them. Philip Chase getting the win here and moving on. So as we look at our next round in the book battle, we have got Warriors Don't Cry up against Visiting Hours. That's a memoir against poetry. Both of them deserve a win, but I'm going to give it to the poetry. They both hit me hard. That brings us to a battle between Night Shift by Stephen King and The Wild Card by Arkady Martine, A Memory Called Empire. Stephen King's going to get the win here. Sorry, Wild Card. And then in the second half of the year, the other wild card, also Arkady Martine, A Desolation Called Peace, which I should say something about the story, I suppose. If you are familiar with Star Trek, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, the Trills, the symbiote species, this kind of reminded me of that, except instead of being a symbiote living being, it was a computer chip in the head kind of thing, which was fascinating. I enjoy that kind of storytelling, and then all the politics, political intrigue that goes with that. So when we pair that up against Flying Lessons and Other Stories, which was very literary, I'm actually going to give the win to the wild card. I'm glad I brought the wild card back in. I liked the way that duology was concluded. Then, our last part of this level of the book battle, we've got P.L. Stewart's Alliance Pride up against Philip Chase's The Way of Edan. I remember last year, these authors kept hitting, because last year I read the whole trilogy by Philip Chase, and I read the first 3 books in the series by P.L. Stewart, and so they were spread out throughout the year, hitting up against each other. So here we are once again with the two of them, and perhaps I'm feeling sentimental, and it could be the powerful effect of the audio book and how much fun it was with Alan reading it, but I'm going to give the win here to Philip Chase with The Way of Edan. Dan. Is it fair for a reread to be winning? I don't know. I would have to spend some time philosophically thinking about that. All right, up in the top half, we've got the poetry visiting hours up against the horror stories of Night Shift. Between the two of those, the read that I think deserves to move on to finals is Stephen King's Night Shift. As much as I love the poetry, in the end, normally other genres beat out the poetry. And then in the second half of our semifinals, we're looking at A Desolation Called Peace, that great science fiction, up against The Way of Edan, that great fantasy. And between the two of them, I'm giving it to the Philip Chase book advancing to finals. And once again, we have a finals with Stephen King in it. Stephen King ends up either winning for the year or ending up in finals almost every year. So we've got Night Shift up against The Way of Edan. I'm going to give it to the Philip Chase book, The Way of Edan. It's sticking with me. It's a lot of fun. Who knows? I may just reread it every year throughout the decade. Give it some staying power. I am happy to announce my best read of the year is a reread. Didn't think I'd end up saying that. The Way of Edan by Philip Chase. Really great audiobook. I'm glad that that came together and that we got the audiobook. I'm looking forward to getting more of those audiobooks, hopefully in 2025, 2026. Hope you enjoyed my book battle determining the best read of the year. Tell me down in the comments below your thoughts. Would you have picked differently? What was your best read of the year? What do you have to say? As always, I'm happy to promote reading and promote literacy. I believe that every day is a good day for a book talk. Peace.